Didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, set my napkin on the table, and walked out of my own son's wedding rehearsal dinner while 43 people watched me leave. My phone lit up 11 times before I even reached the parking lot. I didn't answer. Let me back up, because if I just tell you what happened that night, you'll think I overreacted. You'll think I'm one of those stubborn old men who can't let anything go. And maybe I am. Maybe 63 years of trying to hold things together made me exactly that kind of man. But I need you to understand what the previous 31 years look like before you judge what I did in that parking lot. My name is Frank. I'm 63 years old. I spent my career as a structural engineer. Not glamorous, not rich, but steady. I designed load-bearing systems for bridges and commercial buildings across 3 states. I took pride in that. You build something meant to hold weight. You make sure it holds. That was my philosophy about everything. Marriage, family, responsibility, my wife. I'll call her my wife because that's what she was for. 3 decades. Her name is Deborah. We met when I was 31 at a church potluck of all places, which feels ironic now. She was a legal secretary, sharp-minded, well-dressed, always knew what she wanted. I admired that about her. I was the kind of man who second-guessed himself. She never did. I thought that balance would work. For the first several years, it did. We had 1 son. His name is Colin. He was born when I was 34. And I will tell you plainly, that boy was the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything I did, every extra shift, every weekend I skipped to stay on a project, I told myself it was for Colin. To give him a foundation, that was the engineer in me. Build something that lasts. What I didn't see, what I refused to see for longer than I should have, was that while I was building foundations, something was rotting in the frame. It started small, the way things always do. Deborah began going to a fitness class on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. That was fine. I encouraged it. She started coming home later. 30 minutes, then an hour. Then she'd shower immediately and barely speak through dinner. I noticed. I told myself I was paranoid. She started using a second phone for work, she said. Her firm had given them all second devices for client communication. That also seemed reasonable. I was an engineer, not a private investigator. I trusted the explanation I was given. What I couldn't explain away was the credit card statement I pulled up one Sunday morning in March. I was going through our finances because we were refinancing the house, and I found charges at restaurants I'd never been to. Hotels 40 minutes from our home. A jewelry store I'd never heard of, $312. Not a fortune, but nothing I recognized. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that morning. Deborah was upstairs getting ready for church. I didn't say anything yet. I took photographs of the statements with my phone. I put everything back exactly where it was. And then I went upstairs, put on my good shirt, and drove my wife to church like I did every Sunday. That, I think, was the moment I changed. Not when I found out. Not when I confirmed it. The moment I changed was when I decided to know before I acted. I didn't hire a private investigator. We weren't wealthy people. I was a mid-career engineer with a good salary and a mortgage, and a son in his 2nd year of college. I didn't have PI money. What I did have was 30 years of problem-solving instinct. I started paying attention the way I paid attention to load calculations. Quietly, methodically, without assumptions. I checked our phone plan online, we shared an account, and pulled the call logs. There was a number that appeared repeatedly, most often between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on evenings when I worked late, sometimes multiple times in a single night. The number had a local area code. I reverse-searched it online. It came back to a man. I'll call him the other man, because that's all he was, who worked in commercial real estate. His photo was on his company's website. He looked younger than me by about 8 years. He had the kind of easy smile that comes from never having had to carry anything heavy. I confirmed everything I needed to know over the next 6 weeks. I didn't confront, I documented. Phone records, credit card charges. Twice I noted her car parked on a street 3 blocks from his office for 2 hours in the middle of a weekday when she told me she was seeing her sister. I didn't follow her. I didn't have to. I just paid attention to what was already visible. By the time April came, I knew. And by the time April came, our son had also announced that he was getting married. Colin had been dating his fiancée, Yvonne, for about 2 years. She was a good woman, quiet, kind, worked as a pediatric nurse. I liked her genuinely, not just because she made my son happy. She had a steadiness to her that reminded me of what I'd once believed marriage was supposed to be. The engagement was beautiful, honestly. Colin called me first. He asked if he could use his grandmother's ring, my mother's ring, which I'd kept in a lockbox since she passed, and I said yes without hesitation. That ring meant something. My parents were married 51 years. The wedding was planned for September. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for the Friday evening before at a private room in a steakhouse in town. Deborah took charge of the planning, which was fine. She was organized. She knew the family better than I gave her credit for. What I didn't know until the night itself was what she had planned. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision matters. I arrived at the steakhouse at 6:15. The dinner started at 6:30. I wore the gray suit I keep for formal occasions. I had a card in my jacket pocket for Colin and Yvonne. Not money, just a letter I'd written them about what I hoped their marriage would be. I'd worked on that letter for 2 weeks. The room was already filling up when I walked in. Yvonne's family on one side, ours on the other, Colin's college friends, my sister and her husband who'd driven down from Vermont, my brother-in-law, a few cousins, and the other man. He was standing near the bar, holding a glass of wine, talking to Deborah's younger sister as if he belonged there, as if he had always been there, as if he had always been there. He was wearing a sport coat. He looked comfortable. I stood in the doorway of that private dining room and I took it in. I want to tell you I felt rage. I want to say my blood went hot. But honestly, what I felt in that first moment was something closer to vertigo. Like the floor had tilted, like a structure I'd trusted had just shown me a crack that went all the way to the foundation. I found my seat. My name was on a card, place cards. Deborah had done place cards, and I was seated 2/3 of the way down the table. Not at the head. The head of the table was where Deborah sat, with Colin to her right and Yvonne beside him. The other man was seated directly to Deborah's left, her left, at a rehearsal dinner for our son's wedding. At a table with my sister, my brother-in-law, my cousins. At a table with my sister, my brother-in-law, my cousins. At a dinner I had paid for, I sat in my chair. I poured myself water from the pitcher. I looked at my son, my Colin, who was beaming at Yvonne, who had no idea, who was going over menu choices with her mother. And I made a decision. I was not going to ruin my son's rehearsal dinner. I was not going to stand up and make a scene in front of his future in-laws. I was not going to become the story. I was not going to let this night be the thing Colin told people about for the rest of his life, the night his father lost his composure in a steakhouse private room. So I sat. I watched. I shook hands with Yvonne's father, who was a retired firefighter named Ed, and who had a good handshake and kind eyes. I made conversation with my sister, who kept glancing down the table and then back at me with a look I couldn't quite read. Deborah introduced the other man at one point during cocktail hour as a colleague who'd been helpful with wedding venue research. A colleague. 31 years of marriage, and that's the word she chose. Colleague, I nodded. I said hello. I looked him in the eye for exactly 2 seconds. Then I excused myself to the restroom. walked down the hallway, sat on a bench near the coat room, and took 5 slow breaths. The appetizers were being served when I returned. I ate the shrimp cocktail. I drank 1 glass of wine. I answered when spoken to. I watched my son laugh with his future wife, and I held that image, and I told myself, this night is for him. Just get through this night. Then they did the toasts. Deborah's toast was the 3rd one. She stood up with her glass. She looked at Colin and Yvonne, and she said, I can still hear it. She said she was so proud of Colin for finding a partner who makes him better. She said that a good marriage requires 2 people who choose each other every single day. I looked down at my plate, and then she said she wanted to thank everyone who had been so supportive during what had been, she paused, a difficult transitional period for the family. I looked up. She was looking at him, not at Colin, not at me. At him. He raised his glass slightly, just barely, a small private gesture in a room full of our family. I set my napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back. I picked up my jacket from where it hung on the back. I walked to Colin, bent down, and said quietly into his ear, I love you. This is a beautiful night. I'll call you tomorrow. He looked up at me with confusion just starting to form on his face. I shook Yvonne's hand. I nodded at her parents. And then I walked out. By the time I reached my car, I had 11 missed calls. By the time I reached my car, I had 11 missed calls. By the time I got home, it was 19. Deborah, her sister, one of our cousins. 3 calls from a number I didn't recognize that I would later learn was the other man calling from his own phone, for reasons I still can't fully explain. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I made a cup of coffee. I sat in the chair by the window that looks out at the backyard, the yard I'd landscaped myself 15 years ago, the oak tree Colin used to climb, the garden Deborah had given up on 3 summers back, and I sat there until the neighborhood went quiet. Colin called the next morning. I answered that one. He said, Dad, what happened? I said, I need to tell you some things. But not today. Today is your wedding day. I will be there. I will be standing next to you when you marry Yvonne. Whatever happens, I want you to know that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think I already know, Dad. That was the only time my voice came close to breaking. I will not walk you through the legal proceedings in detail. I'll tell you only what's necessary. I had spent 6 weeks documenting. I had phone records, credit card statements, dates, and locations cross-referenced against her stated whereabouts. I handed all of it to a family law attorney here in the county, a woman named my lawyer who had been recommended to me by a former colleague and who looked at my documentation and told me I was better prepared than most clients she saw who'd hired investigators. The divorce was filed 4 months after the rehearsal dinner. Deborah's attorney attempted to characterize the marriage as mutually broken down over time. Irreconcilable differences, the standard language. My attorney presented the documentation, the timeline, the credit card charges, the phone records. Because we had been married 31 years, and because I was the primary income earner through most of that time, and because the affair had been ongoing for a provable period of 22 months based on the records, the settlement was structured in a way I could live with. I kept the house. I kept my pension. I gave her a fair share of the joint savings, because I'm not a cruel man, and because she had spent years raising our son, and I don't believe in punishing people with poverty. But I kept what I had built. I want to be honest about something. Winning, financially or legally, didn't feel like winning. It felt like sorting through rubble. The thing no one prepares you for is what happens in the quiet. The first winter I spent alone in this house, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd built my life around a structure, routines, dinners, the sounds of another person in the house. And when that structure was gone, I had to learn how to live in the empty space. I started cooking for myself. Real meals, not just sandwiches. I took a woodworking class at the community center on Wednesday evenings, something I'd always meant to do and never made time for. I finished a workbench I'd had half built in the garage for 6 years. Colin and Yvonne had their first child, my granddaughter, who I will not name here because I want to protect her privacy, and on the afternoon she was born, Colin called me, and I drove straight to the hospital, and I held her, and I thought, this is what hold, not the structure I thought I was building. This. My granddaughter doesn't care about rehearsal dinners or credit card statements or 31 years of history. She reaches up and grabs my finger with both her small hands, and that is the whole weight of the world. And it is exactly enough. I want to say something about dignity, because I think it gets confused with a lot of things. Dignity is not staying silent because you're weak. It's not performing for an audience. It's not even making the smart, legal move. Dignity is knowing what a moment deserves and giving it only that much. That rehearsal dinner deserved exactly one thing, to be my son's night. So I gave him that night undamaged, and I walked out before I could damage it further. Not because I was being noble. Because I loved him more than I needed to be right in that room. There's a difference. I've had people ask me, friends, my sister, even my attorney at one point, if I regret not confronting Deborah publicly, if I regret not saying something when the other man raised his glass. I don't, because here's what I know. After 63 years, humiliation that you choose to perform belongs to you. Humiliation that someone else performs belongs to them. I walked out of that room carrying nothing that wasn't already mine. That was 2 years ago. I still live in this house. The oak tree in the backyard is doing well. It's had 2 good growing seasons. The workbench is finished and solid, and I built 3 small bookshelves on it since, one of which is now in my granddaughter's nursery. I go to Colin and Yvonne's for Sunday dinner most weeks. Yvonne makes a good pot roast. Colin grills when the weather allows. I don't know what Deborah's life looks like now. That's not bitterness. It's just that her story stopped being my story. And I don't need to track it. My story, as it turns out, was never really about her. It was always about what I built, what held, what, when I walked away from the table and into the cold parking lot of the steakhouse on a Friday night in September, was still standing. My son's hand on my arm the next morning, my granddaughter's grip, the workbench in the garage that took me 6 years to finish and is not going anywhere. These are the load-bearing things. Everything else was just weight. I've thought about that night a lot over the past 2 years. Not obsessively, I'm past that, but the way you think about a close call on the highway. You replay it not because you're still scared, but because you want to understand exactly what happened and why you came through it the way you did. What I understand now is this. Every outcome in that story was something I helped build, long before I knew I was building it. I spent 31 years being the man who kept the structure standing by himself. I absorbed the weight. I filled the silences. I told myself that providing was the same as connecting, that showing up financially meant I was present. I was wrong about that, not wrong enough to deserve what Deborah did. I want to be clear about that, but wrong in a way that cost me years I can't get back. The choices we make about what we're willing to overlook, what we're willing to silently carry, shape the world we end up living in. That's not punishment. It's just how things work. And the choices I made after I found out, the 6 weeks of quiet documentation, the decision to walk out of that dinner instead of exploding in front of Colin and Yvonne's families, the decision to let my attorney speak instead of my ego, those choices shaped a different kind of outcome, one I could live with, one that didn't take my son's wedding night from him or make his new marriage carry the weight of his parents' wreckage. I think about the intelligence it takes to stay quiet when everything in you wants to speak. That's not weakness. Weakness would have been standing up at that rehearsal dinner and making Deborah the center of the night. Strength was walking out and letting Colin have what he deserved. There's a real skill in learning to distinguish between the two, between the moment that calls for action and the moment that calls for stillness. And most of us don't develop that skill until something forces us to. I was 61 years old before I really learned it. I wish I'd learned it at 30. But I'll take 61. The resilience part. The part about surviving the first winter alone in that house. About learning to cook a real meal for one. About finally finishing the workbench in the garage. That didn't feel noble while I was doing it. It felt like just getting through the day. But I think that's actually what resilience looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like stubbornness. It feels like I'm going to make coffee, and I'm going to sit in this chair, and tomorrow I'm going to do the same thing. And then one morning you realize the weight has shifted. Not gone. Shifted. And you can carry it differently now. My granddaughter grabs my finger with both hands, and she holds on like she has no doubt at all that I'm going to hold her up. She's right about that, and she always will be. That's what I'm still building. That's what holds.